English language and literature are one of the most hated subjects by a lot of people. But don't worry, because we can help you.
Yeah, so there is actually quite a stepwise process towards getting an 8 or a 9 in English language and literature. And in the end, quite a few people who put their hearts to it do get it because it's something you can actually work towards.
Yeah, literally, if you just put in the work, a 9 or an 8 is definitely very achievable for many.
So how this video is going to work, we will talk about our tips for language and then we'll go on to talk about literature. And some of the tips will be applicable to both language and literature. We'll let you know what those are.
Right.
So with English language, it would be a good idea to have a read through the mark schemes, and I would recommend doing this after you've had a go at the paper. So, for example, I've attached the June 2019 mark scheme down below for AQA Paper 1, and after doing Paper 1, all the questions in it, you can have a look at the mark scheme. And not only does it tell you the sort of band descriptors for each question, question 2, question 3, question 4 and question 5, but for the question 2s, question 3s and question 4s, they also give exemplars. So they give a sample paragraph that is to the right standards, and you can use that to sort of compare your answer to see how exceptional it is.
So the next point in language, when actually doing the language papers, is to use contrast when you're analysing different quotes, and also be judicious with those contrasts. So as in like go into each like quote in a lot of detail, offer alternative interpretations, that sort of thing. And by contrast, they don't have to be like really big, bold contrast, like light versus dark. They can be a bit more subtle, like nature versus, horror,
Industrialization.
or something like that.
Yeah. Something else about contrast we need to talk about is that it's also applicable in literature papers. So when you're writing your literature essays, always look for contrast in your texts. So for example, in Macbeth, you have the gentlemanly face of Macbeth in public versus his sort of deceptive and Mephistophelian nature in private.
Cool. Now comes on to question 5, and this is where literally 50% of all your English language marks lie, so it's actually very important. And don't tell me that you can't revise for English language, because you really can. So what you can do is you can use or like plan to use different punctuation, different structural devices such as cyclical structure, which is something really easy to use. So that just mention something once at the beginning and then again at the end, then you get more marks for that. Or you can use one sentence paragraphs, and also plan the methods you're going to use for every question 5. But don't like try bolting them on. Only use it when it's natural.
So in the question 5s of both papers, you have to do some of your own writing. So in question 5 of language paper 1, you have to do some creative writing, either a story or a description. And in paper 2, you have to do some persuasive writing, so writing an argument. In both cases, you're going to want to show off your range of vocabulary, your ability to use various figurative language devices and more advanced language devices as well. And to help this, it could be very useful to memorize some descriptions of certain common themes. So maybe descriptions of the weather, good weather and bad weather, descriptions of people's faces, so maybe old people or young people, description of a building. So any common themes that come up, you can always memorize a description to, and that'll be really useful because you can just tag it onto your description or whatever you're writing in question 5.
Yeah, and you don't have to memorize like whole paragraphs, and just learn a few phrases and you can use that, which is fine. And our final point for language is to really stick to the time. So there is a lot of time pressure in English language, and there's that really there's a really like bad habit of people just using more time to say, okay, I'm going to finish this paragraph off, especially in the earlier questions. and they don't leave you enough time for question 5. So it's really important to stick to those timings. I mean, I'll probably just put the timings up on the screen right now, so you can really stick to them dedicatedly whilst you're doing your mock tests.
So that concludes our tips for language, and now we'll move on to literature. So we like to recommend a hero really in literature.
A legend.
Yes, Mr Salles. So you might have heard of him, you might not, but if you haven't, make sure you check out his channel, because he does amazing videos on literature and language. In particular for literature, he does really detailed grade 9, in fact even beyond grade 9, like A-level analysis of all the poems, all the texts. He also puts out lots of exemplars, because people who got 30 out of 30 or like 4 marks in the essay always send papers to him, and then he goes on to analyse them. So they're a really good source of exemplar essays as well. So definitely be binge watching his videos in the lead up to the exam.
That's what I did. Yeah, so I literally got like a 6 in the work, and somehow after watching Mr Salles and actually doing some work in English, I managed to get a 9. So watch him.
So context is assessment objective 3 in most literature paper questions, and authors are always sort of influenced by the context, by the environment they're living in, by their climate. So always write about how that affects their sort of portrayal of the characters, how they develop the plot, etc. And what's really important about context, even though it's essential, don't just kind of tag it on at the end, just include it, kind of integrate it after your analysis. So to illustrate how this could be done, an example will be attached.
So another tip in English literature is to use alternative interpretations, and this is probably best illustrated with a quote. So I've got here bayonet charge from the poetry anthology, and a quote here is threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. So in this case, yellow hair, so the yellow in hair kind of represents happiness. Or like a joyful emotion, kind of connotes that, and this really contrasts with the reality of war, which Ted Hughes is trying to portray. But another interpretation of yellow is cowardice. So it's actually the word yellow is like we tend to also associate with cowardice, and that kind of shows how the author is afraid of war, despite what it may seem. And you can also go into further analysis. So there's like a juxtaposition with flame and hair. So sort of a playful animal with something deadly, that sort of thing. So you can go into detail like that, and then that gives you the higher level marks.
One note about alternative interpretations: you may be tempted to sort of make things up as you go along. That's a good idea, but don't make it sound unplausible. So sometimes people go so far. Yeah, some people go too deep with analysis and just talk about something that's completely irrelevant. So don't do that.
No, yeah, let's give you an example of that. So, okay, all right. So you see bayonet charge, right? The word bayonet starts with letter B, and B is the second letter of the alphabet, and this shows that Ted Hughes is trying to teach us about World War II, right? Because it's the second letter. Okay, okay,
Yeah,
that's
so
basically an example.
So that'll be an example of going too far in analysis. Cool. Every poem, every text in literature has several good quotes which you can always come back to if you're stuck. So, I mean, this has been a long time, but I remember in Macbeth there were quotes like, "There's daggers in men's smiles," or something like that.
What you egg?
Yep. Oh yeah, milk of human kindness. Yeah, so quotes like these which you can always come back to. Make sure you get lots of interpretation out of them, kind of really squeeze blood from a stone.
Okay, so this kind of links on to our next point, which is to plan the essays for each character and theme for your books, and also themes for your poetry as well. And this would be really useful when it comes to the actual thing, because those plans, or at least one of those plans, are likely to be repeated in the actual exam. If you do it for literally every character and everything. And in terms of the quotes you use, so literally for each poem, all you need is literally 5 quotes, and be really selective with those. And often it's very useful finding quotes that can talk about more than one theme as well. So it saves yourself memorizing a lot more quotes than you actually need to. And that's also true in the books, so like Jekyll and Hyde.
So GCSE English examiners, they're tasked with marking hundreds of long essays, and sometimes, I mean, they're human, so it can get to them. So make sure you have a good introduction so you can, uplift their spirits a bit. Because a good introduction obviously sets a good initial impression, and they'll be more likely to have a high expectation or like a sort of impression of the rest of your essay, rather than if you had like a mediocre introduction, then the rest of your essay is likely to be mediocre as well.
Yeah, we want to use psychological warfare to get those marks.
And this is a bit extreme, but some English examiners might even go so far as to only look at your introduction and just like one more analysis paragraph rather than even marking the whole thing, because that might take a really long time, especially if you have terrible handwriting like I do.
So here is an example of a good introduction. So these sort of contrast introductions are really good, especially when comparing poems or themes. So another really, really important thing for getting that top grade, as Mr Salles says, is to use structure. So a lot of people forget about structure. They mainly focus on methods and similes and words and things like that. The structure is really important and can help you get to that judicious category. To this day, I still don't know what judicious means, but it's probably a good thing. So in terms of structure, there's things like one-word paragraphs, one-line paragraphs, which might be in your books. There's mainly stage directions as well, which you might use. I mean, I think I use some for Romeo and Juliet, but mainly in and in spectacles, where stage directions are really important. Also in the poems, there's loads and loads of structure you can analyze. So especially, remains, the classic, no, not remains, what's it called? So like in exposure, when you've got that sort of cyclical structure, but nothing happens, you can analyze that. There's also, pentameter, what's it called, caesura. Oh, it's all coming back to me now. And the other things, what's it called?
Enjambment.
Oh yeah, caesura and enjambment, all of that, which not many people know. So use that.
So with literature paper 2 and paper 1 as well, you might be a little lost as to how to structure your essays, what's expected of them, what the sort of length of them should be. And so that's why we recommend looking at exemplars and trying to write like several essays at least, trying to match the level of the exemplars, so both the level and the length. And the exemplars got high marks, so if you write something that matches that, you'll probably get high marks in your essay as well. And as I said at the beginning, Mr Salles' channel is a really good source of exemplars.
Yeah, you can ask the school as well.
Yeah, the school will probably give you some too in your lessons. So we come to the unseen poetry now. So by sort of the latter half of the literature paper 2, you will be really fatigued because it's the longest GCSE exam you'll do. But you still have a difficult task ahead of you, which is in the form of the unseen poetry. And a lot of people judge this, but in actual fact, it's not too much you have to do to get high marks. So you have a 24 marker where you have to explore how the author presents something. So in our year, I think it was like the richest poor man in the valley, and it was like explore how the poet presents living a happy life. So it'll be a theme, and then you just have to do the same basically, except without context. So you'll do your sort of ideas presented by the author and also language analysis, and you'll do that like several times, just pick up several examples from the poem, and that's your job done. A really good idea to talk about is the extended metaphor, because they'll usually select poems with this technique in it. It's just really easy to analyse and say deep things about, so always look out for that as well. And there's also other things you can look out for, which you'll probably come across in Mr Salles videos or in class practice.
And you can also look at structure, which definitely not many people will be talking about.
Yeah, that as well.
Okay, so the final thing at the end of your long 2.5 whatever long exam it is, you come to a little 8-mark question. And actually, a lot of people ignore this question completely, and they just tell themselves, okay, you know what, I'm going to spend my time the rest of the paper. I don't want to do this question. But 8 marks is a lot of marks, especially when the difference between 7, 8, and 9 are very close these days. So for this 8-marker, you compare another unseen poem. That's right, 2 unseen poems with the original unseen poem. It's like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you really don't have to write a lot. You can literally just write 2 or 3 paragraphs, and 2 big paragraphs or 3 mini paragraphs, and you'll be fine. The main thing here is just contrast. So literally contrast everything. The main thing is like themes, ideas, and
Techniques as well.
Oh yeah, techniques. Yeah. So as I said earlier, the idea of contrast is literally a very important aspect in English literature.
Yeah, and remember, this last question is entirely based on language analysis, so it's no different from the language paper 1 question where you have to analyze language and the extract.
Cool. So that comes to the end of our English GCSE tips sort of video. Hopefully that was useful. Yeah. Shout out Mr Salles. Goodbye.
Bye, see you in the next one.
Mr. Bruv, compared to you, it's like comparing Asda brand chocolate to Dairy Milk.